They found Pastor Jonathan Gray dead in the back office of his church on a humid summer evening in the small town of Bridgewick. The congregants, who lovingly called him Pastor John, were stunned into disbelief. He had always been a gentle leader, a pillar of unwavering faith, yet behind that polished exterior lay secrets that nobody would ever have suspected. Secrets so fragile and fraught with danger that they demanded the ultimate price, his life. Could a single hidden truth unravel not only one life but an entire community? Are our greatest heroes sometimes the ones with the most to hide? And when desperation and blackmail collide, how thin is the line between sinner and saint? Is it possible that the man we look to for moral guidance could harbor his own deeply buried secrets? Could a guardian of the law betray his badge and become a predator? And how far might desperation push two individuals bound by scandal and blackmail?
Before we continue with this gripping story, be sure to hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications.
The official story that emerged in the immediate hours after Pastor Gray's death was vague. Rumors flew like wildfire through the pews and down Main Street, from the old diner at the corner of Pine Avenue to the lonely gas station near the highway. Some whispered that Pastor Gray had been murdered in cold blood, an assassin lurking in the shadows of the church. Others dared to suggest that perhaps he had staged his own death out of shame. The police responded with a meticulous PR strategy, carefully controlling what details were released. They were adamant that the crime had been motivated by external forces, though no official suspect was named at first. Behind the closed doors of Bridgewick's lone police station, tensions simmered. The lead investigator on the case, Detective Rosie Anders, was a newcomer to the town, transferred from a larger city's homicide department. She couldn't shake the feeling that something about the crime scene reeked of careful staging. Bullet holes in the church office door were angled suspiciously, and the blood spatter indicated that Pastor Gray hadn't merely been shot in a random scuffle. Someone had cornered him, singled him out. Worse yet, it seemed someone had tried to wipe away incriminating footprints. The deeper Detective Anders dug, the more she uncovered a twisted narrative of blackmail, sexual secrets, and a police officer far from clean. Sergeant Russell Drake, a tall, broad-shouldered veteran of the force, was a decorated policeman who had seemingly devoted his life to the service of Bridgewick. But a quiet hush fell over many in the precinct whenever his name came up. Whispers and buried allegations suggested a sense of dread and corruption. If he was involved, that meant the rot went deeper than a simple murder. The story of how Pastor Jonathan Gray died is inseparable from the story of how Sergeant Russell Drake almost got away with murder. It is a cautionary tale about how easily piety can be tainted, and how a uniform can hide deep corruption. It is a tale of greed, desperation, and betrayal that shattered the moral core of a small town, and it begins long before that final fateful night in the church office. To truly understand the depth of this tragedy, we must go back months, perhaps even years, before the final shot rang out. Pastor Jonathan Gray's ministry at Bridgewick Community Church started with modest fanfare. A fresh seminary graduate brimming with enthusiasm, he moved into the church's old creaky parsonage with his wife Miriam. For the first few years, his sermons overflowed with kindness and moral integrity. He organized youth outreach programs, charity events, and visited the elderly in nursing homes. To the townspeople, he was a godsend. As a result of his tireless dedication, the congregation grew in numbers and devotion. Donations poured in, allowing the church to renovate the Sunday school wing and upgrade the ancient boiler system. With financial prosperity came recognition, and soon his name was known in every corner of Bridgewick. Yet, as often happens with positions of public trust, skeletons from the past and new, unexpected temptations threatened to tear down this shiny veneer. Pastor Gray had a secret he bore with profound guilt, a secret that clashed violently with the image he presented to the congregation. He was in love with another man. This man's name was Christopher "Chris" Mason, a soft-spoken volunteer at a local homeless shelter. Chris was the type of person who, like Pastor Gray, believed in charity and kindness. They had met at a regional faith conference in a neighboring town. The connection had been immediate, charged with a taboo electricity that both thrilled and tormented the pastor. One late night, as Pastor Gray and Chris walked by the deserted riverside path, they shared a private kiss. It was an intimate, genuine moment, but it also became the spark that ignited the flame of everything that was to come. Unknown to either of them, a watchful pair of eyes lurked in the shadows, belonging to none other than Sergeant Russell Drake. He was off-duty, stumbling home from a local bar half-drunk and brimming with cynicism. Drake was no stranger to scandal. He had a track record of covering up minor felonies in return for bribes from Bridgewick's seedy underbelly. Small-time drug dealers, unscrupulous businessmen, petty thieves needing a quick out. Though never formally caught, rumors and allegations followed him like his own shadow. He recognized Pastor Gray immediately, having seen him around town at public events. Only a few yards away he watched the pastors tryst in the darkness. The moment Drake's mind registered the scandalous sight, the gears began to turn. Bridgewick worshipped Pastor Gray. If word of this got out, the shockwaves would be massive. Drake saw a golden opportunity to leverage this knowledge for cash or favors. But he also knew the importance of subtlety. Public exposure wouldn't line his pockets, so he kept quiet until the next morning, steeling himself with coffee and headache pills for the inevitable game of blackmail. That Sunday, Drake approached the pastor in his office before the service. He made sure to lock the door. Then, with unsettling calm, he told Gray that he knew about the affair. Pastor Gray's heart pounded. He tried denial, but Drake pulled out his cell phone to reveal a compromising photo. The pastor's denial died in his throat. He stammered, asking what Drake wanted. Drake's initial demands were simple: a few $100s, allegedly to cover some debts. Terrified and cornered, Pastor Gray acquiesced. Looking back, the pastor would later describe this moment as the seed from which everything rotten grew. An unholy alliance built on blackmail and fear. It was the only way he saw to protect his congregation, his reputation, and his family. He believed that if he gave Drake the money, the policeman would disappear and life would return to normal. But Sergeant Drake was only getting started. He had discovered a golden goose. If the pastor caved once, he would likely cave again, especially if Drake quietly gathered more evidence. Pictures, phone records, maybe even video footage. Pastor Gray was now entirely at Drake's mercy. Meanwhile, Chris Mason remained blissfully unaware of the swirling danger. Pastor Gray kept him in the dark about Drake's blackmail, partly out of shame and partly to protect Chris from the policeman's intimidation tactics. Telling Chris would only make him complicit in a dance with a dangerous man. Over the next few weeks, the tension in Pastor Gray's life soared. On the surface, he continued preaching uplifting sermons about love, compassion, and redemption. Inside, guilt gnawed at him every time he accepted a church donation, knowing that a portion of it might soon be extorted by Drake. He prayed fervently for guidance but found no solace. The next demand arrived swiftly, a series of small favors, as Drake put it. He wanted the pastor to put in a good word for him with the mayor, who occasionally attended the congregation, to secure a promotion. He also demanded access to the church's charitable funds for community outreach, which he pocketed. The pastor was reluctant, but Drake spelled it out: either comply or watch your life collapse. Thus began a twisted dance of extortion and remorse that would culminate in an eruption of violence no one could have predicted. Blackmail erodes the soul until there's nothing left but desperation. Months slipped by, each day darker than the last. Pastor Gray's wife Miriam sensed a change. He was withdrawn, eyes rimmed with exhaustion. When pressed, he chalked it up to the stress of an expanding congregation. In truth, Pastor Gray struggled to feed Drake's greed. At first, the payments were modest. Yet as Drake sensed how effortless this was, he demanded larger sums. Each time he presented fresh evidence. Audio recordings of phone calls with Chris, images from a hidden camera near Chris's apartment. Drake's network of shady contacts ensured a steady supply of humiliating insurance. In addition to the money, Drake began using Pastor Gray as a tool to influence Bridgewick politics. Gray was well respected, and Drake needed him to nudge wealthy donors, sway public figures, or silence rivals. The pastor found himself publicly endorsing local policies he despised. After each such endorsement, he felt physically ill, his ethics ravaged by Drake's threats. The only respite Pastor Gray found was in Chris's company. Their bond deepened beyond physical attraction. They confided in each other about spiritual doubts, personal dreams, and fears. But Gray still hid the blackmail, convinced Chris would either leave out of disgust or risk confronting Drake himself. One tense night, Gray met Drake in the deserted church parking lot well after midnight. Drake leaned against his squad car, demanding an outrageous sum, $10,000 in one installment. When the pastor pleaded it was impossible, Drake shrugged and threatened to send incriminating photos to the entire congregation. Pastor Gray felt his world crumble. How could he raise $10,000 without drawing massive suspicion from the church board? He suggested smaller installments, but Drake refused. Pastor Gray went home and sat in his car for an hour, paralyzed by fear. He thought about borrowing from Chris, but it would only drag his lover into this nightmare. Selling his car wouldn't come close. A second mortgage might buy him time, but the paperwork would be glaring. There seemed to be no exit. Unbeknownst to the pastor, a quiet discovery was underway. Alfred Poole, the church's bookkeeper, began noticing irregularities in the church accounts. Thousands of dollars unaccounted for, small but consistent amounts that added up. Poole reported them to Pastor Gray, but the pastor brushed him off with talk of budget reallocation. Poole, once a military financial officer, sensed something bigger. His suspicions grew. Meanwhile, Drake's personal life was also under strain. His wife, Linda, noticed suspicious influxes of cash and questioned him. Drake dismissed her, claiming a lucky streak at the casino. Unconvinced, Linda sometimes followed him at night, watching him exchange envelopes with shady individuals. Terrified but unsure how to proceed, she considered talking to the police chief. Yet, if her own husband was involved in criminal activity, who could she trust? Drake was addicted to the power. The hush money funded his gambling and lifestyle upgrades. The more he gained, the more he wanted. His manipulations spiraled, like a precarious tower of cards awaiting the slightest nudge to collapse. And that nudge was coming soon. One Sunday morning, Drake sat in the front pew during Pastor Gray's sermon, openly smirking. The pastor stumbled through his message, sweat beading on his brow. Congregants exchanged glances. Gray excused himself early and retreated to his office, his composure shattered. Miriam followed, concerned, but he lied about a migraine. Each lie stacked precariously on top of the last. The next board meeting revealed the church's budget shortfall. Alfred Poole voiced his concerns. Pastor Gray attempted a haphazard defense, but his explanations sounded hollow. The board gave him a short grace period to produce documentation. With the clock ticking, Gray realized he was cornered. He had to confront Drake or risk everything unraveling. Neither man knew how violent that final confrontation would become, or how many lives would be torn apart in the process. Pastor Gray found Drake at a dingy bar on the outskirts of Bridgewick, a place the pastor had never set foot in. Under flickering neon lights, Drake sipped whiskey. When Gray sat next to him, the policeman raised an eyebrow, amused. "Didn't expect to see you here, Reverend," he drawled. Pastor Gray ignored the bartender's offer of a drink. "We need to talk," he said tightly, voice low. "I can't keep doing this. People are starting to notice the missing money. I'm risking everything, my wife, my congregation, my reputation." Drake took a slow sip of whiskey. "That's not my problem," he said. "You think you can just decide you're done? That's exactly what I'm saying." Gray fired back, surprising himself with the anger in his tone. "I've given you everything. I won't do it anymore." Drake laughed darkly. "You think this is a negotiation? If you cut me off, your congregation will get every juicy detail about you and your boyfriend." The pastor slammed his fist on the bar, drawing startled looks. "I'd rather you do that than keep bleeding me dry," he hissed. "Go ahead, expose me." Drake's grin vanished. Anger flared in his eyes. After a tense beat, he leaned back. "You're making a mistake," he warned. "Don't come crying when your world crumbles." Pastor Gray stood abruptly. "It already has," he said, and walked out. That evening, Drake unleashed a barrage of texts and voicemails. He threatened to plaster photos of the pastor and Chris all over social media. He described how he'd snail mail them to the church board and Pastor Gray's wife. The pastor resolved to stand firm, telling himself that truth, even ugly truth, was better than endless blackmail, but dread gnawed at him. Drake, meanwhile, fumed. He told himself that Pastor Gray was the real villain, a hypocrite who deserved punishment. If he couldn't get his money, he could at least ruin the pastor's life. Desperation stoked Drake's malice. He had grown dependent on those illegal funds, and now his golden goose was about to vanish. A few nights later, Drake summoned Pastor Gray to the church's back office for a final conversation. Desperate to settle things without further scandal, the pastor naively agreed. The atmosphere was tense, the church empty and silent save for the hum of old fluorescent bulbs in the hall. Drake wasted no time when Pastor Gray arrived. "You owe me," he spat. "You think you can just walk away after all I've done for you?" "You mean after all you've stolen from me?" the pastor shot back, standing behind his desk. "I won't give you another cent." "That's so," Drake challenged, taking a step closer. "You really want me to drop those photos into Miriam's inbox?" Pastor Gray trembled but held firm. "If that's what it takes to end this, so be it." Something snapped in Drake's eyes. He pulled out his gun, pointing it at the pastor. "Don't be stupid," Gray pleaded, voice shaking. "This is a house of God. Where was your God when you were sleeping around?" Drake snarled. "Last chance, $10,000. Pay up or your world burns." Pastor Gray's voice broke. "I have nothing left to give." At that moment the door handle rattled. Miriam Gray, worried about her husband's late-night meeting, stood in the doorway, eyes wide with horror. She saw Drake with a gun, her husband cornered behind the desk. She screamed. Drake swung the gun toward her. In a desperate attempt to protect Miriam, Pastor Gray lunged at Drake. A gunshot rang out, echoing in the church corridors. Then another. When the smoke cleared, Pastor Gray lay on the floor, blood soaking his shirt. Miriam clung to him, screaming for help. Drake stood there, shock contorting his features as he realized what he had done. Sirens pierced the night. A neighbor had heard the shots and phoned the police. Drake's survival instincts kicked in. He wiped surfaces, stepped on footprints, concocted a story about an intruder. By the time officers burst in, he was in another room, phone to his ear, acting as if the pastor had been shot by a fleeing criminal. Miriam was too distraught to piece things together. Pastor Gray's life slipped away in her arms. So began the cover-up, a desperate, sloppy plan that set in motion an investigation that would shake Bridgewick to its core. Paramedics arrived quickly, but Pastor Gray was fading. They rushed him to the hospital, Miriam by his side. Drake, meanwhile, feigned shock, claiming an armed assailant had shot the pastor before escaping. Detective Rosie Anders arrived on scene, taking in the bullet holes, the blood spatter, and the lack of forced entry. Drake's story smelled rotten. The angles of the shots indicated a close-range struggle, not a distant shootout with a masked intruder. At the hospital, doctors fought to save Pastor Gray. He succumbed to his injuries before midnight. A hush fell over the town. Their beloved pastor was gone. At the station, Drake filed his official report. He'd come to the church after receiving an anonymous tip. He encountered a masked gunman who fired on Pastor Gray. Drake claimed he shot back, sustaining a minor graze himself, but the assailant fled. Detective Anders noted the inconsistencies. No forced entry, no footprints, no record of an anonymous tip. She questioned Drake about his missing phone, but he claimed he dropped it in the scuffle. Nothing added up. Over the next days, the media painted Pastor Gray as a victim of random violence. Candlelight vigils were held. The congregation mourned deeply. Yet a handful of people felt uneasy. Why would a mysterious shooter target a pastor? And why did Drake's story shift whenever he retold it? Rumors swirled. Some insisted the pastor had hidden secrets. Others whispered about Drake's questionable ethics. Chris Mason grieved quietly, afraid of being outed. Alfred Poole, the bookkeeper, grew more convinced that the financial irregularities and the pastor's death were connected. Poole reached out to the police, insisting he had evidence to share. That was how he landed in Detective Anders's office, briefcase stuffed with church financial records that would blow the case wide open. Detective Anders met Alfred Poole at the public library, away from prying eyes. Poole explained how he'd uncovered systematic siphoning of church funds. Large sums went to community outreach accounts, but there was no outreach program. He showed Anders wire transfers labeled R. Drake. Anders's pulse quickened. This wasn't just about a crooked cop. There was a direct link to the pastor's missing funds. It suggested extortion, blackmail, or both. She asked if Poole had shared this with anyone else. He hadn't, unsure who to trust in a department that might be compromised. Armed with this intel, Anders revisited the crime scene. She brought a seasoned forensics officer, Carlin Wynn, to methodically search for overlooked clues. They found new evidence, bullet trajectories and spatter patterns contradicting Drake's account. Even more damning, they discovered a bloody partial handprint beneath Pastor Gray's desk. Testing showed it matched Drake's left hand, proof he'd been far closer to the pastor than he claimed. Determined to confront Drake, Anders summoned him for a follow-up interview. Drake arrived, guarded and irritated. Anders presented the bank records. Drake countered that Pastor Gray had donated to his private charity. She pointed out the forensics, the bullet angles, the suspicious lack of forced entry. Drake tried intimidation. "Watch yourself, Anders," he growled. "Accusing a fellow officer could end your career." Anders didn't flinch. "And murder ends yours," she replied. "I'll be speaking with your wife next." Enraged, Drake stormed out. Anders felt certain now, Drake was guilty. She just needed a final piece to tie it all together. That piece appeared when multiple witnesses mentioned Chris Mason's close relationship with Pastor Gray. Anders decided to pay Chris a visit. Chris, living in a modest apartment above a bakery, let Anders in hesitantly. He confessed that he and Pastor Gray had been romantically involved. He explained how Drake discovered their affair and used it as blackmail leverage. Chris described how the pastor had seemed panicked lately, mentioning impossible financial demands from Drake. Tears welled in Chris's eyes as he recounted the pastor's frantic last days. Anders left with the final puzzle piece. Motive. Drake had discovered the affair and extorted money from Pastor Gray. When the pastor stood up to him, Drake escalated, leading to a confrontation that ended in murder. All that remained was to tighten the net around Drake. Forensic Officer Nguyen returned with a completed ballistics report that contradicted every element of Drake's story about the masked intruder. Confronted with this, the district attorney agreed to pursue an arrest warrant for Sergeant Russell Drake. At dawn on a Tuesday, Detective Anders led a small team of trusted officers to Drake's home. Linda Drake answered the door, stunned to see half a dozen armed men and women on her lawn. Drake, rousted from bed, emerged in the living room just in time to see Anders with the warrant. "Russell Drake," Anders said firmly, "you're under arrest for the murder of Pastor Jonathan Gray." Drake's eyes blazed. He hurled accusations of a setup and insisted he was innocent. Officers cuffed him and led him to a patrol car. Neighbors peeked through curtains, shocked to see a once-respected sergeant taken away in handcuffs. At the station, Drake was fingerprinted and photographed. The same officers who once respected him looked on with grim faces. In interrogation, Drake stuck to his story of the mystery gunman. But when Anders showed him the forensic analysis, the bank statements, Chris Mason's testimony, and the partial handprint, his composure cracked. He ranted that Pastor Gray was a hypocrite who deserved to be exposed. He blamed the pastor for lunging at him, causing an accidental discharge. Anders methodically recorded every word. His confession, though incomplete, was enough to confirm the blackmail and the final confrontation. The district attorney prepared a murder charge. Drake's arrest shocked the community. Some refused to believe he was capable of murder, while others recalled rumors of his corruption. The church congregation, already reeling from Pastor Gray's death, was stunned by the revelations of a secret affair and blackmail. A wave of complicated emotions swamped them: betrayal, grief, anger, and confusion. Miriam Gray battled her own emotional storms. Discovering her husband's secret affair was a gut punch, yet she learned he had tried to shield her from Drake's threats. Despite her pain, she stood by the truth. The man she married had been pushed to unthinkable extremes. Slowly, compassion softened her anger. Chris Mason, racked with guilt and sorrow, faced community gossip. To his surprise, several church members reached out in sympathy. They saw that he too was a victim of Drake's manipulations. A few told him that Pastor Gray genuinely cared for him, and while they disapproved of the pastor's deception, they recognized the tragedy for what it was: a life snuffed out by greed and fear. Detective Anders, who had quietly done her job, found herself labeled a hero by many in Bridgewick. She had rooted out corruption and unraveled a shocking murder. She also faced resentment from officers who felt betrayed by the arrest of one of their own. But most recognized that Drake's actions had poisoned the department, making his removal a painful necessity. After days in custody, Drake's lawyer approached the district attorney about a plea deal. In exchange for a lighter sentence, Drake would confess to blackmail and second-degree murder. In a taped statement, he admitted to discovering Pastor Gray's affair, using it for extortion, and confronting the pastor at the church. He insisted the gun went off by accident during the struggle. For the prosecution, it was sufficient. The bullet trajectories told a different story: multiple shots fired at close range. But Drake's partial confession would save the county the cost and uncertainty of a long trial. Pastor Gray's congregation, however, reeled at the details. Their beloved pastor had hidden a relationship, blackmailed by the very man sworn to protect the community. Despite the plea deal discussions, a trial ensued for formal sentencing. Each day, the courtroom was packed with media and townspeople. Miriam Gray, dressed in black, listened stoically. Chris Mason tried to avoid the cameras, escorted by a friend for emotional support. The prosecution laid out a damning timeline. Drake discovered the affair, demanded hush money, and escalated to threats of public exposure. When Pastor Gray refused one final demand, Drake confronted him, gun drawn. The defense tried to spin a narrative that the pastor attacked Drake first, but forensic evidence, eyewitness testimony from Miriam, and statements from Chris demolished that version. In a dramatic moment, Miriam Gray described walking into the office, seeing Drake aiming a gun at her husband. She recounted his look of shock and terror after the shots were fired. The jury appeared visibly shaken. Alfred Poole's testimony added another nail in Drake's coffin. Meticulous financial records traced thousands of dollars from the church accounts directly to Drake. Every attempt by the defense to discredit Poole failed. The numbers were indisputable. After deliberating for 2 days, the jury returned with a verdict of guilty on second-degree murder. While some had hoped for a first-degree conviction, the jury felt premeditation wasn't fully proven. Nevertheless, Drake faced a long prison sentence. In handcuffs, he glowered at the spectators while the judge pronounced his fate. The conclusion of the trial did not erase Bridgewick's pain. Miriam Gray faced the daunting reality of moving on without her husband. She wrestled with her anger over his affair but found peace in knowing he died trying to protect her and the church from scandal. Over time, the community's support helped her heal, and she publicly forgave him, reminding everyone that we are all sinners in need of grace. Chris Mason, crushed by grief, eventually moved away for a fresh start. Though some in Bridgewick condemned him, many offered compassion. A handful of congregants reassured him that the pastor's affection had been genuine, that love and frailty often coexist in the human heart. Detective Rosie Anders found herself hailed as a champion of justice, though she was quick to redirect credit to her colleagues and the brave witnesses who stepped forward. Some in the department viewed her with suspicion for taking down a fellow cop, but truth had prevailed over the thin blue line. As for Bridgewick Community Church, attendance dwindled briefly. The new pastor who eventually filled the pulpit preached open-hearted messages of forgiveness, transparency, and moral courage. Slowly, the congregation mended, learning to hold both the good Pastor Gray had done and the flaws he harbored in the same breath. In the end, the shocking story of the corrupt cop and the pastor's shocking end stands as a reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how easily it can be shattered by greed, secrets, and moral compromise. It underscores the resilience of a community that chose to face the ugly truths, piece by painful piece, rather than remain in denial. If any lesson endures, it is that even when faith is tested and the very institutions we rely on are shaken, redemption can still be found in the light of truth. In confronting the darkest parts of human nature, Bridgewick learned that true justice and genuine grace can and must coexist. If you can't get enough of the secrets, lies, and jaw-dropping scandals that lurk beneath the surface, subscribe now for more mind-blowing investigations and spine-tingling exposés. Hit the notification bell so you never miss a new twist, and share this story with anyone who lives for shock, intrigue, and scandal.